Hello, bonjour, Tassi. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here tonight and braving the roads on this, the first wintry day we've had in a long while. I want to begin in a good way, recognizing that we are gathered here together this evening on Treaty 6 in Amiskwite-Wiskawigan, the Beaver Hills House, Edmonton, which is the territory of the Cree, the Dene, the Blackfoot, the Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux. I acknowledge that this territory is home to many Métis peoples and within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. I am grateful to the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations, and for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders, those who are with us today, and those who have gone before us. My name is Dr. Jennifer Tepper, and I have the honor and privilege of being the Dean of the Faculty of Education and also the Chair of the Visiting Lectureship and Human Rights Selection Committee. I extend a very special welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. Cindy Blackstock, who flew in from Ottawa to be here with us this evening. And of course, you are all here to see her, not listen to me. Welcome to all of you in our audience, including our distinguished guests and other community leaders who are here with us tonight, and I want to recognize Chancellor Peggy Garrity with us as well. I would like to open the evening by introducing you to Elder Gilman Cardinal and Cookham Hazel McKennett, who are going to start things off in a good way. Cookham Hazel McKennett is part of the Indigenous Health Initiatives program at the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. Originally from Sandy Bay First Nation Treaty 1 territory, she is a fluent Anishinaabe speaker and is a 10-year residential school survivor. As a former teacher, Hazel has worked with both Edmonton Public Schools and the Catholic School Board in developing Indigenous programming and has extensive community engagement experience. Cookham Hazel is also an Indigenous women's health advocate and health system navigator and volunteers in support of urban Indigenous women and initiatives as part of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit People. Elder Gilman Cardinal, a Big Stone Cree Nation Treaty 8 territory, grew up in Calling Lake, just north of Athabasca. Living in Edmonton, Alberta, Elder Cardinal supports his First Nations members living in rural and urban areas. He is one of 3 elders in the Indigenous Cancer Sharing Circle with Alberta Health Services. He also teaches the Indigenous Learning Initiative for Alberta government staff. Elder Cardinal became an elder at age 50. Before then, he worked for Alberta's government, supervising on-the-ground projects for training and employment initiatives. Then, tragedy struck. He had a heart attack and was clinically dead for 8 minutes. The doctors brought him back. He was flown from Slave Lake to Edmonton to the Royal Alexandra Hospital. He had successful heart surgery and began his recovery. His recovery took him to Maskwacis to a healer, the late Elder Bert Crane. An offering of protocol was made by Elder Crane, asking Elder Gilman to consider walking the eldership path. Elder Cardinal has passion to empower young people and teach others about his beautiful culture. He was a second-generation residential school survivor and had a remarkable healing journey. Combined, these things made him excellent for the role that he accepted and is so graciously here in tonight. And you should also know that Elder Gilman Cardinal is very proud of his 13 grandchildren and his 2 great-grandchildren. So Cookham Hazel and Elder Gilman, I would like to invite you to start us off in a good way.
Chimigwach nungum kandumiek, kinanakominim, kinagego chiminusek, nungumiga quechmananik, kitnemaganinanic, chibita vimiguango, umanungum wegaisisek, apichukchigego agaweque, minikego gatashikang, tagamiawege, iga kendamin, kinachinasne chimanachint, keget kinamichitutamang nungum igagagwete minie. Good afternoon or good evening. My name is Hazel McKennett, and like I said, I was born and raised on a reservation in Manitoba. I'm a 10-year residential school survivor, and I'm a proud mother of 3 boys, and a grandmother of one, and yet one to come. One's on the way. That's my greatest accomplishment in life right now. But pray with me. Center yourself. Be at the moment so that we can help one another to learn more about ourselves, about our community, about our families. Let's all sit together and let's call our ancestors, and especially the ancestors that walked on this land before we welcomed our visitors. Many people from our tribes walked on this land, hunted and fished and lived here. So we are walking on land that had our ancestors on it. And I encourage you to ask your ancestors, wherever you may come from, and in your own way, in your own language, in the way you know best. Let's ask them to come and sit beside us. Wiggle yourself a little bit and give them the room to come and sit with us. And you will find that they will guide us, all of us. Let's look at one another as friends, as partners, and in this life and in our paths to save our children. I know my residential school years, why I always say keep your language and work in your language is because I was forbidden to speak my language. So I encourage everybody, because that's part of you, that's your roots. You keep that language and keep it in with your children. I always encourage you to do that, and you will be more a whole person when you do things like that and allow other people. And if you have that opportunity, then you must. That's all what I always say, to work with one another in a very good way. That's how our ancestors lived here before. They worked together because they had to survive. And we are survivors, but we are also thrivers. We survive because we work together, and we always say we have to be strong for one another and for our children. So I ask you to do that with me in your own way. And thank you very much for listening to me, and hopefully we'll meet again on this journey. Thank you. Now we will ask Elder Gilman Cardinal from the Treaty 6 territory. He's rightfully, this is his area. I'm from Treaty 1, so I'm a visitor here, even though I'm older than him.
You're gracious, Kokum. Thank you very much, Kokum. This is the Kokum and Mushroom show, along with Florence. So thank you all again, and thank you for protocol, and thank you for asking me to be here. It's such a sacred day. I've done lots of work with Faculty of Native Studies, and it's always a pleasure. So I honor all of you. I honor Florence also, my pal. So she got me here. She's been planning to get me here for a long time. She's got ways, that lady. What? Very, very sacred ways. But I want to ask our speaker, Cindy, Dr. Cindy Blackstock, to come forward. We have a gift for her, something I've put together on behalf of all of us. Collectively, everybody in here, we're going to gift her with something very sacred. In our culture, our Indigenous culture, one of the most sacred ways we honor our role models is by the gifting of eagle feathers. And most of you probably understand, or a lot of you understand, the meaning behind that. It's one of the most sacred ways in our Indigenous way. Just like going to a course and taking maybe a 2 or 3 year program, and you get a certificate. It's the same meaning, and that's why I love my beautiful culture so much, just like the rest of you. So with that, I'll have these beautiful ladies behind me hand me that white container. And Cindy, Dr. Cindy thought it was cookies. I said, no, it's way better than cookies. So on behalf of all of us, and we can gather here in front, and we'll show you what we're gifting Dr. Cindy Blackstock. An eagle feather from all of us Faculty of Native Studies, all of the audience, for having you lead the way as Native people, Indigenous people. We have said, Kiam, whatever happened in the past. Cindy took the next step and said, no, that's not good enough. We need to have some accountability, the way, and I won't go into too much politics, but she has led the way, and she absolutely deserves to say eagle feather. On behalf of all of you, if you give her a round of applause, and thank you very much. Don't forget that teddy bear, you promised me.
I promised you the teddy bear. I will do. I owe him a teddy bear. It's out there. I will deliver.
Okay. Thank you very much. Hey, thank you.
Thank you so much to Cookham Hazel McKenna and Elder Gilman Cardinal for opening this event in such a good way. The University of Alberta launched the Visiting Lectureship in Human Rights in 1998 in recognition of the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The university's goal in offering this lectureship is to provide our students and the people of Alberta and beyond with an opportunity to understand the complex issues at play in the world, and to also provide pathways and encouragement for us all to act to address these issues. Since this annual lecture began, we have had many opportunities to hear from lecturers who have contributed significantly to the promotion and advancement of human rights in a variety of contexts. The lectureship has provided us an opportunity to discuss controversial and difficult subjects, and by doing so, we have had the opportunity to learn, to question, and participate in events shaping the world in which we live. Tonight, we have the opportunity to renew our commitment to the advancement of human rights in our local and global communities, and I know tonight's lecture will continue to challenge, motivate, and inspire us. The lecture we are about to hear is titled Reconciling History and will be presented by Dr. Cindy Blackstock, who you got a sneak peek of just before. And following the lecture, we will engage in a question and answer period, which will be moderated by Dr. Florence Glanfield, who you also got a sneak peek of. Dr. Glanfield is currently Vice Provost, Indigenous Programming and Research, and a Professor of Mathematics Education in Secondary Education in the Faculty of Education. So she is a friend and a colleague of mine. She is an affiliated faculty member with the Centre for Research for Teacher Education and Development at the University of Alberta. Dr. Glanfield is a citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta, born and raised in northeastern Alberta. Her research interests explore the experiences that individuals as well as collectives of learners have with mathematics and learning mathematics. She collaborates with colleagues and has engaged in research projects with Canadian Indigenous communities, urban Aboriginal youth, elementary and secondary mathematics teachers, and teacher educators and teachers in Tanzania and Rwanda. Dr. Blackstock is going to be introduced tonight by Dr. Verna Yu, who is our interim provost and vice president academic here at the University of Alberta. Dr. Yu is one of Canada's most respected healthcare leaders and has spent more than 2 decades holding executive roles across academia and the provincial healthcare system, where she is known for her exceptional servant leadership philosophy. Dr. Yu is also a well-established leader within the national community, having served on many boards and committees, including the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada and the Canadian Institute for Health Information, among others. She has received numerous awards for her service, most recently being named a Global Woman of Vision in 2019 and ranked second on the Medical Post 2021 Power List of Physicians in Canada, as well as undertaking her teaching and clinical care. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Verna Yu rejoin our University of Alberta as our provost. So welcome, Dr. Yu.
Thank you very much, Dean Tupper, and good evening to everyone. On behalf of the University of Alberta, thank you for joining us in person and online to participate in the 21st Visiting Lectureship in Human Rights. Thank you, Elder Gilman and Kokam Hazel, for opening this event in such a fabulous way. And my sincerest gratitude to the donors whose generosity helped make the vision of this lectureship a reality. Today we recognize human rights, the right to safety, to dignity, to life. These are just a few examples of the 30 articles declared by the United Nations. Following generations of Indigenous and allied advocacy, it has only been recently that the Government of Canada extended these fundamental rights to Indigenous peoples, and the work to rectify past and ongoing wrongs continues across the nation, including on our campuses. And with us tonight is a leader on this front, Dr. Cindy Blackstock. A member of the Gitxsan First Nation, Dr. Blackstock serves as the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, and as a professor at McGill University School of Social Work. With more than 30 years of experience working in child welfare and Indigenous children's rights, Dr. Blackstock has published more than 75 articles relating to reconciliation, Indigenous theory, First Nations child welfare and human rights. Dr. Blackstock worked with her colleagues on a successful human rights challenge to Canada's inequitable provision of child and family services and its failure to implement Jordan's Principle. Jordan's Principle is a child-first and needs-based principle designed to guide Canadian public policy and administration to ensure that First Nations children living on and off reserve have equitable access to all government-funded public services. This hard-fought litigation has resulted in hundreds of thousands of services being provided to First Nations children, youth, and families. Frequently, Cindy can be found in the company of the Caring Society's Reconciliation and Bear Rister Spirit Bear, engaging children in meaningful actions to implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to actions. The theme of tonight's presentation, Reconciling History, is a call to action here for research, teaching, and learning at the University of Alberta. Please welcome Dr. Cindy Blackstock.
So what a great honor to be here on Treaty 6 territory and home of the Métis Nation, and for all the Inuit people and everyone else who joined us here. You know, one of the great puzzles in my life is understanding how a 4-year-old little girl who needs breathing equipment is denied that breathing equipment because she's First Nations. I can't understand why First Nations children have to grow up and dream about getting a clean glass of water. I don't understand why in 2022 we still have a racist-based piece of legislation called the Indian Act that says when children are born, whether they are a status Indian or a non-status Indian. What does it mean if you are a recognized member of a First Nation and someone says that you are non-status? How does this happen in a country that waves the flag of human rights so vastly? Where were all of us in kind of raising the alarm about these egregious human rights abuses? Why is it that we accept words from government like, oh, gee, it's too complex, or, we can't make change overnight, or we've done more than any other government before it. You see, I know the whole speech. These have been the things that have always captured my imagination. And I think it has something to do with the creation story of Canada itself. And that's what I want to spend some time talking about today, is a creation story of Canada and how what we were taught to believe about ourselves and about the country that we now call Canada, how that is actually created a circumstance where we can turn the page on the tragedy of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. So let's take let's go back in history through a time warp, if you like. I'm going to see if I can get this thing to advance. Oh, it's not advancing. I'm stuck on myself. That's never a good thing. They're going to figure out how I'm going to advance this. There's a switch on the side. You see? John A. MacDonald must have been at work here. All right, now we're going to see if we can work. There we go. Okay, we're going to get in that time machine and we're going to go back and we're going to imagine ourselves as the people of the period back then. You know the time when people didn't know any better. Or when people, even if they did know any better, they didn't have the solutions to fix anything. And you know what? Even though some bad things happened to the Indians, look at all the good stuff that was done. That time is where we're going to begin. So, just recently, here in this territory, in Treaty 6 territory, the Pope came to visit. And I was actually on the other side of the world, which was probably a good thing. Because what I noticed was very interesting to me. I saw roads being paved where survivors themselves had to walk on gravel for decades. Families with baby carriages had to struggle over the gravel, or persons with disabilities. I saw $33 million appear out of the federal coffers to fund the trip, when they had struck a deal with the Catholic Church to avoid $25 million in compensation. I saw an apology that had to be asked for. And in my tradition, apology is not something that you ask for, it's something that you earn. You see, I come from the West Coast where we actually have things called shaming poles. And they're put up when you mess up. And they're not put up by you, they're put up by those you've hurt. And they're only taken down when you have done the actions that are necessary to demonstrate that you have changed your ways. So this whole idea of apologizing and then promising to take action later is a curiosity to someone like me. You know, I remember the words of the elder in RCAP that said, integrity is when words have meaning. And it seems to me that when it comes to addressing egregious human rights abuses, that the meaning has to come before the apology. Otherwise, it's too often in service of the wrongdoer. We also heard something else interesting, and that was the apology on behalf of a few bad apples in the church. Now, this same apology theme I had heard before, and so had you, when the Government of Canada offered its apology, remember. There were bad people back then who didn't know any better, and if they did, they would have done things, right? Or even the old dark chapter narrative is about pushing all of the colonialism into the past. Don't worry, folks, things are okay now, right? Let's look at Thomas More. This picture is one of the hallmark pictures of the tragedy of residential schools. It is to symbolize the underlying mission of colonialism that can be broken down to a dichotomy of the savage and the civilized. That's really, when you get down to it, that's what it is all about, where everything that's First Nations, Métis, Inuit is all savage, and everything that is not is civilized, right? And we see this in contemporary academia, if you will, where we have an elective First Nations, Métis, and Inuit course, and then we have the real stuff you need to learn, right? There's an assumption of things being culturally neutral if they're generated from Western ideology, but somehow if it's First Nations, it's only good for the First Nations folks. Don't want to use that over here because that's a cultural thing that we don't bring over there. It's not to say that the proper protocols with knowledge shouldn't be used, but there's this ghettoization that happens in universities that's a hallmark of this. Now, many people, when looking at this photo, are to see the before and the after picture of Thomas More and tuition in Regina Residential School. But the reality, as John Malloy, the historian, and Amber Johnson would point out, his colleague, is far more poisonous than that. You see, on the left, there is no such regalia that Thomas More is wearing. It was fashioned together by the residential school staff themselves. Both pictures are after tuition. They were meant to be propaganda for the Canadian public, to see the transformation into civilization in real time, the betterment of that child. This is one of the children that sadly Thomas dies just weeks after this photo. He would be one of the children in the unmarked graves. Now, what about this myth that we tell each other about, well, people didn't know back then, and the media was soft on everything, right? Media wasn't telling anything that was going on. These are headlines from 1907. The one on the left is from the Victoria Times Colonist. The one on the right is from the Saturday Night Magazine and the Toronto newspaper. And what they are commenting on is Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce's report. He was the Chief Medical Health Officer of the Indian Department. And by the way, one of the top, top public health officials of his time, he was president of the American Public Health Association. He wrote Ontario's first health code, which was widely copied in other provinces and into the United States, given his station as American Public Health president. He had gone to the residential schools and found the level of healthcare funding in the schools was so deplorable. And in fact, to give you a sense of how much less they were getting, folks in the city of Ottawa, where I spend most of my time now, they were getting 3 times more healthcare funding than all the Indians across the country. This, Bryce said, along with deplorable health practices like putting sick children with tuberculosis in with well children, the malnutrition of children, the poor ventilation, all these things we've become familiar with in COVID-19, that was creating incubators of disease with death rates as high as 50% over 3 years. And in one school for which there was complete death statistics, for every 3 kids who walked in, only 1 walked out alive. Now, Dr. Bryce was a man of science. He was convinced he would bring this to the Laurier administration. Now, this is something else we don't do. We're all sitting there talking about John A. Macdonald, but we skip over Laurier. Well, this is the Laurier administration. He was convinced that if you bring this evidence forward, so they would act and they would save the children's lives. The cost of his reforms were $10,000 to $15,000. Many of you are quickly thinking back, and you're thinking, well, that was a lot of money back then, and you were right. But not in the context of the Canadian government. You see, the annual budget was about $100 million back then. And the government of Canada did not fail to act. They chose not to act. That's a different thing. There's a difference between failing and choosing. They chose not to act. Didn't think the kids were worth the money. So all of this hits the headlines, and we end up, as you, people of the period, would have read those headlines in that day. And I would suggest to you that these headlines are more clear than what we saw in the aftermath of Kamloops. Remember the debate? Oh, it's not mass graves. We don't want to say that. It's only unmarked graves. To the children in that have lost their lives and their families, there really is a difference without a distinction. And so here you have Indian schools deal out death. Startling rate of mortality is shown to the department, right? So it's not just Dr. Bryce who's appalled. Clearly these editors of the newspapers are equally as appalled. And because they're putting it above the fold in the newspaper days, that is clear that they think the readers will also be appalled, and many of them were. We'll get to that in a minute. But I think the thing on Saturday Night Magazine is actually the most compelling reason. It says something here. It says his report, that means Bryce. His report is printed. Many people will scan the title on the cover. Some will open it, a few will read it, and so the thing will drift along for another year. And so with the next year and the year after, such will be the course of events, the protests of medical officers buried in blue books and the complaints of missionaries lost in pigeonholes. Here is the headline. Unless public opinion takes the question up and forces it to the front. That is still the challenge. When the headlines die, so do the children. That was true in 1907. It is true today. Now, let's talk about some of the readers. This is Samuel Hume Blake. Anybody here in law? Oh, one person on law. You might know Blake's Law Firm. It's one of the big Bay Street firms. This is one of the co-founders, Samuel Hume Blake. His brother, by the way, Edward Blake, put up the bounty for Riel's head. Samuel Hume Blake had a different view about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. So it would have been an interesting birth of Blake's law firms, his co-founders. But anyway, Samuel Hume Blake reads about these headlines. He just cannot believe it. And he says, in that Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness to the charge of manslaughter. And here I return you back to the Pope's visit. There was conversation amongst many about holding wrongdoers criminally responsible. And that is a legitimate conversation. But the question needs to be asked and it needs to be answered. Is the government of Canada, as Blake suggests, guilty of manslaughter as a government? Is the Catholic Church guilty of manslaughter as a church? Not as a few wrongdoers, but as an institution. So with the other churches, does it rise to that level? This was the type of conversation happening in 1908, and we could not bring ourselves in our collective national consciousness to be able to have this debate and ask these questions in the wake of the affirmation of the survivors' truce in Kamloops, Cowessess, and other areas. Now, of course, it isn't just the non-Indigenous folks who are blowing the whistle. And one of the things I say about history, I hear people call it whitewashing. I don't think it's that way. I call it rightwashing, where we take out any dissenter from the historical narrative so we can preserve this mythology that people back then didn't know any better. We get rid of all the people. In fact, one of the things for the Métis in Louis Riel, John A. Macdonald makes this famous speech in Parliament, and he says, "He shall hang and every dog in Quebec shall bark." And what is he talking about? Of course, the he is Louis Riel. The barking in Quebec are tens of thousands of people who are protesting the rigged trial and his wrongful death, right? But we don't hear about those headlines of the 10,000 people, right? We hear about the people who are on the jury of the rigged trial. But here's a child in the wake of Dr. Bryce. You see, Dr. Bryce kept on pressing on. He kept on speaking out. He was determined in that to get the public consciousness. And he writes in 1922 a pamphlet called A National Crime, taking up, again, Blake's theme about whether this was actually criminal activity. And it had another set of headlines. Same type of egregious reaction from the public. But the headlines died and the schools marched on. And in 1923, we get this letter from Edward B. Now, this is in John Malloy's book, A National Crime, which I think every Canadian should read because it tells the story of residential schools from the perspective of the Government of Canada's own documents. And as you can see, this little boy addresses it, "Dear Parent." But like many other children in residential schools, the mail was often intercepted because it was contrary to the civilizing mission to let children know that they were loved. Right? The whole system, as one survivor told me, was designed to make children cry. Right? So he writes a "Dear Parent," and he's making this plea about the conditions in the school, which are akin to what Bryce found in 1907. The children are so hungry, they're eating cats and they're eating wheat. And they're being treated cruelly by this teacher, but his own form of resistance as a child is not to give her his tears. Now, this letter, we don't know if it ever made it to his parents, but it did make it in the hands of Duncan Campbell Scott, the chief bureaucrat on the Indian residential school file. Now, I had met Duncan Campbell Scott before when I was a teenager. And he was presented in our Canadian literature class, which I have to say was a huge downer because I love poetry and prose. I read Chaucer and everybody else, and then we get to Duncan Campbell Scott. And, it was like, woohoo, here's the Confederate poet for Canada. And no one talked about his day job, right? There was no narrative about his day job. But he actually says in response to this letter that 99% of the children in the schools are too fat anyway. Now, I don't know if many of you have seen pictures of children in residential schools, but that description on its face is just completely erroneous, right? Let's go up a few decades. The residential schools are still running, right? We're now into the 50s and the post-war period. But by this time, there is the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And by the way, that's another mythological story where we talk about Canada being such an enthusiastic bastion signing that. We had to be dragged into signing it by Eleanor Roosevelt herself, right? I think we voted against it at least 3 times before Eleanor Roosevelt intervened. And the reason for that is because, of course, there was the internment of Japanese Canadians in the Second World War and the ongoing treatment of the Indians. And that Human Rights Declaration Canada thought might interfere with its activities domestically. But let's turn to Jerry Gamble. He's an interesting person because he actually is an employee of the Department of Indian Affairs. Or rather, should I say, he was an employee before he got fired for being too close to the Indians. So he finds himself doing a talk at a human rights conference in Tobic First Nation. And the topic of his presentation is the top ways that the government steals Indian rights. He says basically there's a whole code book here. And I don't produce all of them here, but I want to run a few past you and see if you think it's familiar. The first one boils down to the be patient speech. This comes up a lot with clean drinking water, right? Now, it goes something like this. Now, you'll see the number of long-term, keep that word in mind, long-term boil water advisories is going down, and we have a graphic here. Sure, there's more work to do. But look at that number, and we've done more than anybody else. Now, no one defines long-term. And actually, you can make something go from a long-term advisory to a short-term advisory simply by trucking in water. Right? So it's not turning on your tap and getting a clean glass of water. But it feels like progress, right? And there's a sensibility that you should be grateful because I'm working so hard. And look at all the people who now have at least no long-term water advisory. And it's complicated. And then, we have to go out and talk to First Nations people before we give them drinking water, because maybe they don't want drinking water, I guess is the theory. And I've heard this narrative, and this isn't a slant on any particular party, but I've heard this from all of them. You know, I actually would like to just kind of rewind right through question period, because I think I could do the whole narrative just every single time, make it 5 minutes, and then save Canadians lots of money, right? But the be patient speech is actually always given by those who have a clean glass of water at home. And it's a way of rationalizing the inhumanity, the ongoing inhumanity, by proclaiming the wrongdoer as a benevolent giver. And that ties to one of Gamble's other points about when you get thanks from your victims. So many of you may be aware that the federal government continues, as in Bryce's time, to fund public services on reserve, and does so in general to a far lesser level than all other Canadians. But when they announce money in the budget to remedy partially of that inequality, they want us to be thankful. In fact, it's not just them that want us to be thankful. Sometimes I get questions from journalists, well, aren't you thankful? And I said, well, let me put it this way. I said, if your child was going to a school and they were getting 50 cents on the dollar, and all the other children were getting $1, and I came to you and I said, you know, it's your lucky day, you're now going to get 55 cents on the dollar. How grateful are you going to be for me for that? I said, but that's the invitation, right? And sometimes we as on the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit side, we get sucked into this because we're afraid that if we challenge it, they will take it away, or they won't give us the rest of it for our kids. Right? And this is where Dean New's book, Accounting for Genocide, is so important. Because now what Canada does is funds most Indigenous organizations, and they control them through the funding agreements, right? There's this veiled threat out there. You stand up or against us, then you get your funding taken away, right? And then there's the old photo op, which is a currency of government, right? And one thing I pride myself on is I try not to do photo ops, right? I don't think there are any photo ops of me out there, but, you know, because that's their currency. It's used to kind of really embed these ideas. So let's talk about the case that I've been involved in, and I want to give a nod to everybody who came before in the struggle of dealing with that inequality. But when I entered the field in 1997, I thought that I was kind of like Bryce. I was convinced that these inequalities that were driving First Nations kids into care at higher levels in residential school, that all we had to do was show Canada that they were doing that, show the harm, and work with economists and get them to cost it out. So I got together with First Nations folks who are far smarter than I am, and we did it. And I even remember thinking, oh, well, they're a bit skeptical, but I think this report's really going to do it, right? As a new kid on the block. Sure enough, we get a nice letter from the minister. Thank you for your report. We're reviewing it. Then they sit on it. And the report gets old. So they now say, we need a new report. Now, as being as smart as I am, I stepped up and said, sure, let's do another report, right? And we do another report. And by then we find that the inequality has grown so that First Nations kids are getting 70 cents on the dollar for family support. And the inequalities in other areas are piling up too, right? So all of this creates a perfect storm for disadvantage of families. They're coming out of the wake of the trauma of residential school. They have far fewer support services than every other Canadian. And the Canadian public is trained to judge them as if they get more, right? This is the poisonous cocktail that's at work here. So thankfully, we had an elder on our group who really taught us that there will come a time for the Caring Society that we would have to go all in against Canada. The way that he put it is, don't fall in love with your business card, and don't fall in love with the Caring Society. Only fall in love with the children, because there might come a day when you have to sacrifice both those things for them. And at that time, we had about 40% of our funding was federal, And sure enough, within 30 days of filing the complaint, the feds were right on it. They cut all of our funding. So up until today, we still are the only national organization that is not funded by the federal government. In fact, we turn down money from the feds. We don't want their money because it doesn't pass our ethical screen, because they are still hurting First Nations kids. And it's thanks to great board members like Corin who let me say no to money all the time. So we filed this human rights case, the Assembly of First Nations and the Caring Society, on authority of the First Nations leadership and with the support of so many skilled First Nations folks who are working with children. Even then, I thought they would do something. I thought they would be serious. They would know we're serious and they're going to do something. This is a quote from a report, that second report. It's one of the few times when I predicted the future, and I think it came true. It said, the cost of Canada doing nothing could result in Canada being found vicariously liable for discriminatory funding and child welfare, knowingly resulting in harm and disadvantage for another generation of First Nations children. The political fallout will be substantial, especially on the heels of residential schools. You know, one of the ways academia messes up and is unhelpful in reconciliation is that we do what I did, which is we presume the reason the problem is unsolved is because there isn't a solution. We're very poor at going back and looking at the piles of reports. Had I done that, I would have found literally piles of reports showing the inequalities, the harms to kids, and that the government of Canada was choosing not to do it. And then there's another step to that. Okay, well, if they're choosing not to do with it, how courageous are all of us going to be in compelling a different result for children in this case, right? What price are we prepared to pay in the whole market economy of justice, of achieving justice? And to say that they knew was an understatement. They also knew the brutal inhumanity of what they were doing. On the right-hand side, if it was blown up, these are exhibits from the main trial. They're all Government of Canada documents. On the right-hand side is the website that they had up the day that we filed the complaint. They took it down after I filed it in evidence, but at least even I could figure out how to do a screenshot back in 2007. And it says there that the underfunding of the system is linked to the growing numbers of children in care. And then if we look at this at the bottom, Q3, these are Deputy Minister's speaking notes for a parliamentary committee. And you can see, why should an interim funding strategy be accepted when a comprehensive plan will be developed by March 31st, 2006? I'm still waiting for that comprehensive plan, by the way. But anyway, they say circumstances are dire. Inadequate resources may force individual, that's First Nations agencies, to close down if their mandates are withdrawn or not extended by the provinces, and it goes on from there. Circumstances are dire. And whose circumstances are dire? The children and their families. And then we have at the top, you can see here that, you know, they're talking about the placement rates on reserve reflect a lack of available prevention services. So when the Government of Canada had an emergency meeting about the high rates of children in care, I was kind of thinking, well, the emergency actually was a few years ago. You guys are late to the party, right? These same recommendations have been made time and time again. So how do we break the pattern of just regurgitating this to actual reaction? Here's how deep it goes into the public service. And I'm going to deal with the public service in a minute. I want to say that I am grateful that person wrote down circumstances are dire. That is one thing that I would ask of any public servant, that you are writing down the truth. That is in and of itself a real support. And I'll talk about how the mind control in the government really, I think, tries to vanquish that out of you. But writing down the truth is really, really critical and really helpful. But here's another truth. This is a case from November 29th, 2012. It involves a 4-year-old little girl who went in for dental surgery and something went horribly wrong. She then has cardiac arrest, and she requires assistance with all aspects of daily living, and she needed a hospital bed to keep her at a specific incline so that she could breathe properly. The request, now you'll notice it's, Mom is due to have another baby, and it's during the Christmas season, just as Edward B's letter was written during the Christmas season of 1923, we find here, almost 99 years later, a similar situation. Now, when we talk about how systems perpetrate human rights abuses, this went through the hands of 15 different public servants. 15 chances for someone to bring forward their ethical self and say yes, before someone at the end of the chain of command writes absolutely not. So how does that happen? I don't have all the answers, but I think about Zygmunt Bauman, the great sociologist, and he wrote a Modernity and the Holocaust, which I recommend to people. But basically what he said is that the Holocaust happened because of science, because of academia, because of engineering. And he said how these groups like doctors and engineers and lawyers and social workers and nurses and so on, how could they sign ethical codes and then go on to perpetrate such egregious genocide? And he said part of the answer is founded in bureaucracies. When you step across the threshold, your own personal ethics are usurped by the deal to do loyalty to the organization. Your goal is to be loyal to the organization, and you'll get rewarded for that, right? And there's groupthink that allows you, that first piece when you're in there and you feel that discomfort about doing something that is unethical. And then you think, well, everybody else, maybe I'll just do it once. It's that first step across that unethical line that is the most difficult. But then you'd be surprised how easy it is to take the second and the third and the fourth step down that trail, right? So we have to support in the public service, ethical public service in the first instance, and ensure that persons who exercise that are adequately protected. Canada has some of the worst whistleblower laws in the Western industrialized world. So the tribunal decision comes out, it looks at the evidence, 72 days of trial. Sometimes people, I was so interesting, I read the headlines, Runaway Human Rights Tribunal, right? Forgive me, but that happens a lot out of this province. I hear this. The problem is that we've actually been to federal court 7 times, and we've also been to the Federal Court of Appeal. If it's the Human Rights Tribunal running away, so is the federal court and the Federal Court of Appeal. I don't even know how many decision makers we've had on this case. The evidence is so clear and convincing, anyone who looks at it finds that Canada's behavior is discriminatory. But it makes a very important link back to Canada's behavior in residential schools. It finds that Canada's old mindset, the same old mindset that allowed for Edward B. to be in that terrible situation, or for Thomas in the Regina residential school, all of that is still operational. No one has looked at the culture of the department and asked, what do we need to fix there? What does the department need to be reformed, right? It's always about, we're going to reform child welfare, we're going to reform First Nations, we're going to reform the Métis community. Well, the question needs to be asked, how do we reform the government, right? And this is where, in the people visit I found interesting too, I find it problematic that we too often use the healing narrative. The healing narrative puts the work back on the victims. The justice narrative puts the accountability back on the wrongdoer. To stop the successive handing down of this type of behavior and culture that manifests in human rights abuses. So I'm close to the end, you'll be happy. And I'm going to check my watch to make sure. So I have been thinking about myself as a case study. How is it that I, and to some degree Bryce, How is it that we walked into this space, we saw this clear wrong, and we thought it could be fixed with evidence and a report alone? And I was in my living room vacuuming in 2021 when I saw a debate in the House of Commons, and the question was being asked of the Prime Minister, why are you fighting for First Nations kids in court? And so I turned down my vacuum. Want to hear the answer? And I hear, we are not fighting Indigenous kids in court. I dropped my vacuum. I literally say QAnon, right? How can you say this? Because that Monday we were due in federal court where the government of Canada did not want to pay compensation to the victims that it hurt, included that 4-year-old, and also did not want Jordan's principal to apply off reserve. How can you make that statement with that much righteousness in the face of such contradiction? Did he not know? Like all those questions. And then I happened to be listening to a political podcast in the United States. I should never do that, right? But I did. And this guy was on there, and he wrote the book, The Cult of Trump. And his whole work is looking now at how to deprogram people like the convoy people, frankly, the QAnon, the big lie people. And I reached out to this guy, and I said, you know, I've never thought about it this way, but I think the department is a cult. You know when you float one of those ideas to an expert and you think, well, and actually, you know, he said, yeah, kind of, that's exactly what kind of it is. So let's talk about mind control and undue influence and how this works. So Stephen Hassan and my wonderful colleague, Melissa Bretan, who's here, we've been experimenting about this whole thing of the interface of undue influence and colonialism. So let's go through a couple of examples and see if they kind of resonate with you. So we'll start off because I am from BC. I think our First Nations cultures from the West Coast get underplayed, so I am not choosing a buffalo. We are going for the salmon, right? And by the way, these are not Atlantic salmon. No Atlantic salmon here. So we start off the top. I am a salmon, and I'll always be a salmon. Okay? That's where you're free thinking, and you got your identity in play. But then someone says to you, you know, it's people like you, fish like you. You ever notice, like, not a lot of them are doing a lot of good stuff. A lot of them are on the take, right? And that leads to, why am I not like the other fish who aren't on the take? Do I really want to grow up to be a fish on the take? Right? Then there's more undue influences put onto you. And then you start to do what's natural, we find with children. Even in parental disputes, it's the children will codify that as something that's wrong with them, right? They start to do that. That's natural for all of us, right? We get to that place. What's wrong with me? And then it becomes easier. It doesn't take as much undue influence, right? You put another thing, and then you say, it really hurts when I say I'm a salmon now. And then you get under there and you say, I'm not a salmon, I'm just a fish. That's what it is. And then at the bottom, I've never heard of a salmon. Right? This is how it works, and it can work very quickly, especially in the age of social media now. Right? That's what Stephen Hassan will tell you. And especially we have algorithms that just feed in the same kind of information that is meant to do exactly this, right? So let's take a First Nations understanding. This is too often where we start. We talk about colonialism, its impacts on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And that's part of the conversation, but we need to flip it and say, what is the impact on non-Indigenous folks? I'm going to do that in a minute. So I have inherent rights and a distinct culture. I'm up the top there. And then, all of a sudden, in my case, the government of Canada shows up and says to the Gitxsan, you did not exist until we saw you. Now, we didn't believe that one. And neither did the Supreme Court of Canada, which resulted in Delgamoot, right? But then they take our lands And they hurt our kids when we resist. And that leads to a lot of confusion. Well, what should I do? I don't want anything to happen to my children, right? I mean, I still believe this, but I don't want that. Then you get down to the, what's wrong with me? And then you get down to, I better stop resisting because I'm hurting my kids. And then you get down to, the government says it will negotiate inherent rights, and that's progress. And maybe in some situations it is. That's the other thing, right? And then you're down there and you're taking a photo op with the feds or the province, and you're thanking them for the discrimination that they're giving to you, right? I see a lot of nodding heads, okay. So, let's do the public servant. And I say this as a former public servant. I was actually a public servant for 9 years, which shocks most people. It still shocks me. But what I realized is that very quickly that I did not have a future in the public service. Because the advert that recruited me into the public service was they were looking for young leaders. I thought, well, I'm young. I'm not a leader yet, but I'm young. I'll apply. And I got in the door. And it went something like this. So I have strong morals, and I'm going to make change from the inside of the child protection system. That was my goal, right? So I get in there, change maker, opportunities everywhere. I see them. And I start voicing some of those things. And then I get where there's the camp around the coffee pot, right? Well, just wait till you've been here a little longer. You'll understand, right? And then I keep on speaking out, but then the supervisors say, you know, you got to be loyal in the organization. You can't be insubordination, you know, like that's not a good thing. You could find yourself not being able to make your rent payment pretty quickly, right? So then you start to think, well, everybody else seems to be getting along okay. What's wrong with me, right? And then the next step in the journey is I better not rock the boat or I'm going to be fired. And then there's a bit more undue influence, and it's actually sometimes in the way of reward. Thank you for being quiet. And you see people rising into bureaucracy, not because of their talent, but frankly from the way that they polish boots sometimes, right? So there's these signals about undue influence is not always that adverse, it's rewarding the wrong kind of behavior. And I'll tell you a little anecdote about Bryce. So Bryce died feeling he was a failure because he couldn't help the kids as much as he tried. Despite his moral courage, his greatest lament was a phrase his family said, that the work did not get done. And on Duncan Campbell Scott's side, John Malloy has said that there's a very interesting letter he sends to his editor shortly before he dies. And he says, I've never done anything courageous in my entire life. That's the closest to a lament we get from Duncan Campbell Scott. But it provides some insight about the danger, the cost, the personal cost, as well to you and to the public you serve when you go down this rabbit hole, right? And so we have the government is, now I'm below the water, right? I can't even remember the time when I was above the water, right? I'm not even surfacing for oxygen that often. Sometimes I get a burst, but I'm somehow able to defend against it, right? I can rationalize it away. And it's like the government is really trying, and sure, there's more work to do, right? And then at the bottom, you're saying, I'm a loyal public servant, and nothing we do is good enough. You become the victim. And that's how Canada has portrayed itself, even in our case, but also in Bryce's case. It was a victim of not being appreciated enough. And that's that archetype in action of the colonial savage dichotomy. You need to be thankful to me because I am doing something for you, the savage, which I do not need to do. Natan Obed of the Inuit Chaparasat Kitnami, I was on a panel with him, and he said something very important, I thought. He said, you know, why is the observation of basic human rights like health care, water, called reconciliation for us and not for everybody else. That's not reconciliation, right? We didn't say when there was a big storm in Ottawa and the power went off, there wasn't a big reconciliation ceremony when they threw the switch and put it back on, right? So this is what it looks like for the public servants, but also for Canadian society. Do you know when you broke that rule last year? In the wake of the affirmation of the survivors' truths, the great historians Eva Jewell and Ian Mosby, check out their report on the Yellowhead Institute on the TRC calls to action. All of you individually, wearing orange shirts, showing up and talking to your members of parliament. The governments collectively implemented more TRC calls to action in the following 6 weeks than they had in the previous 6 years. Part of what has been fed to you is that you are powerless. What can I do? When you've already proven what you can do. And also, I will say that your efforts as Canadians, joining First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples during that time, also forced the federal government, along with more growing list of legal losses in a court, to announce the $40 billion deal for First Nations children, which is not enough, as we're going to get to in a minute. But that would have not come had it not been for the sea of orange shirts. But the problem is that only lasted for about 6 weeks. And now we've forgotten again. We've gone to sleep again. But we have the opportunity of awakening again, right? And making the nap times for all of us is just like toddlers. It becomes less, we nap less. And we see the headlines and we become more aware. Okay, so here's how I went. I started out there. I was actually on the other end. It can go in the inverse, right? You're so bathed in this indoctrination that you don't see it. I'm at the bottom. Oh, the government doesn't know. We'll tell them. We'll write these reports. And then evidence is going to convince them. I was there. The government has a report, but still not doing anything. Must mean a different report. We'll do another report. And then I start getting confused, right? And then I finally get to it. They're not going to do anything. Time for court. And then they'll know we are serious. Right? And then finally I had to realize that they were choosing not to do it. And they would not only choose not to do it, they were going to fight to make sure they didn't have to do it. And that's when they cut all our funding. And actually that was, for us, a time when we became free. It was a very, very difficult time for us. We had almost no money in the bank, but thanks to our great board, we made it through. But it was about setting yourself free from the chains of that kind of restraint that was essential. And now I'm no photo ops, none of that kind of stuff. And I'm constantly questioning myself about what is the bath that I'm bathing in. And how can I unpack that for myself so that I start reclaiming some of that ingenuity from my ancestors? How I start reclaiming the real humanity of our people, and how I stop excusing these various rationalizations for the flagrant human rights abuses of First Nations, Métis, Inuit people, and people around the globe and throughout the country as well, right? So this is what the kind of stuff that can change when you actually move outside of that box, right? So we have, for the first time in the country, First Nations families receiving help to keep their families together versus separating them. That's never happened before. We have children receiving help under Jordan's principle. That 4-year-old little girl, if she was around today, she would have got that hospital bed. And it applies on and off reserve. We're still dealing with this issue of on and off reserve. Like, it's ridiculous. The word reserve is, in my view, even offensive. The only other kinds of reserves we have are wildlife reserves, right? It tells you how this whole language stuff is set up and how we've normalized it, right? I saw it in South Africa when I was there. I was teaching in Durban, and they saw my Indian Act card, And they knew it at once, and they brought out their black identity cards. And of course, they were very similar because Canada went down and tutored the South Africans on that whole Indian Act regime, and that became part of the apartheid regime, right? But when I saw Canadians, they were all supporting Nelson Mandela, rightfully so. But they would then walk by the Indian department and not even blink an eye. See, this is how the mind control kind of stuff works, right? So last week, we had some news on the compensation decision at the tribunal. Because now the narrative is as well, that 40 billion, that must have fixed everything. And you might have heard when the children won the compensation for the human rights abuses, the Prime Minister and others went out and said, we're actually not going to pay the Human Rights Tribunal compensation. We want to settle it through a class action because we want to give people more. Now, by this point, I'm skeptical. I want to be a believer, but not so much. So they had their press conference, and I do mine on my own and say, these are words on paper. I want to see what this comes to. And what happened is that for some people, they would get more than the $40,000, and that's a good thing. And there's more people entitled, also a good thing. But what was not good is that they would actually disentitle some children in care from their compensation and reduce the amounts for others and leave others in a very lack of clarity. And so this is where we find this hypocrisy, if you like, about the violation of human rights, the taking away of human rights that were already awarded by the courts in order to legitimize some kind of other recognition of other people's human rights. This type of thing is completely antithetical to what I believe. I really believe that every child is sacred, and we cannot have justice if we're treating our own people unjustly. And so the tribunal did not agree with the final settlement agreement, and they sent it back to be fixed, which it should be fixed, because here's the thing, the liability is Canada's, right? Canada is the one that owes these children the compensation. And so it's Canada's whose feet we need to hold to the fire for paying that compensation, right? Not only paying the compensation, but doing more than that, doing what the survivors of residential schools, the 60 Scoop survivors, and even these kids today have asked us. The best apology is change behavior. Do not do this again to another generation of kids. All right? So the other thing that came up in the headlines last week is the sky is falling. The money is gone for prevention and everything else. Well, no, it's not. It's actually 75% of it is actually subject to legal orders from the tribunal. And Canada is holding back the other 25%. And what I say about that is Canada should release those funds. Children are in need of this money. You don't play this kind of trade-off game when you've done such a history of wrongdoing and children are in need. If you're truly reformed, you provide the money for the children in need. You're not worried about getting something for yourself, right? But even if we're successful, all of these inequalities remain, which is why we all need to continue this experiment of unpacking our own thinking and also becoming much more active and not turning the headlines or scrolling down the Twitter headline quicker than we would before, that we actually humanize the abuses that are in front of us and embrace our own power to change things. So here's what I would say. This is how far I've gotten, my own little self-regulation, is when I do things by reflex, when words like healing feel like the right word to say all the time, those are the words I give the most scrutiny to now. I check my assumptions. I ask myself those fundamental questions. And I ask them in the company of people of different diversities so that I can explore different threads of the answer. I look at historical sources. I am a great fan of historians and anthropologists. But I also am a great fan and even a greater fan of elders and knowledge keepers. I want to avoid normalizing discrimination. I want to practice moral courage like Bryce did. We too often in academia get nurses and engineers and everybody else to sign codes of ethics, and then we fail to teach them the courage to activate those values when the chips are down. And we need to do a far better job of that. And we need to encourage applied academics. I think it's so interesting, people call me an activist, right? That's code in academia for saying not a serious academic. Right? That's what the code is. And what we need are people out there who are actually applying their skills. And we saw that from the great scientists and the physicians and the nurses and the others in the healthcare sector during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still with us, right? So when knowledge gets applied, then it can make a difference in society. And I firmly believe, I'm a prophet, McGill, I firmly believe that my academic freedom is not just a grant, it's something that I earn, and it's earned in service of the community. It's a debt that you owe back to people. So we need to find ways of supporting applied academics. I would like to see our human rights, the social SHRC and CIHR and all these granting bodies actually funding the implementation of research that's already on the books that we know would make a difference instead of generating more knowledge, right? I think generating new knowledge is often overvalued, huh? And each of you tonight have 7 free ways to make a difference on our website. One of the things that we're very keen on, the children have taught us, is that making a difference in the world should not be transactional for those who have money. It's not, the most meaningful thing you can do is actually not open your wallet. The most meaningful thing that you can do is not turn the page, is to hold your elected officials accountable, to ask more of them and ask more of yourself, to watch those headlines and demand change. Because it is true, I think, I've come to understand, that governments are neither moral or logical as an organism. There are sociopaths, which means they're very sensitive to maintaining power. And that's why the sea of orange shirts that were brought forward by the children in the unmarked graves. You see, I think they came now because they knew that this generation of children needed them. That's why they appeared. And the question is, what's our answer to all of them? That's something that you'll write in your actions and in your thinking in the days and weeks and years to come. But never forget your power to change the life of a child. That's it.
Wow. Cindy, thank you. You always leave me with 1,000 wonders. And boy, thank you very much for those powerful words. I think I'll always want to be a salmon and the swimming upstream.
And not Atlantic.
And not Atlantic.
I just came from Maliseet and Mi'kmaq territory, and we always have this great debate. But I tell them, look, your salmon are hardly pink.
Very pink, right?
Yeah.
Well, I can't top that. Dr. Blackstock, thank you again from my heart, from all of us in this room, all of us watching on the live stream, for accepting our invitation to deliver the lectureship in human rights. Your presentation has been so thought-provoking, moving and powerful, and the call to moral courage, I think, will resonate with all of us for days to come, and thank you for the ways that you demonstrate every day moral courage to the work on behalf of the children and the families. It has been an absolute privilege to spend the afternoon and the evening with you. You remind us that in the 74 years since the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have made advancements in the recognition of human rights, but we also know that there is much left to be done to ensure equity for Indigenous peoples in Canada and around the world. And you've helped us think more deeply about how that can be achieved through our collective actions and our orientation to the work. This lectureship would not exist without the generosity of the many visionary citizens, corporations and foundations of Edmonton and beyond who believe it is important for our community to hear speakers such as Dr. Blackstock speakers who celebrate and illuminate powerful ideas, who inspire and provoke discourse, who challenge us to think more deeply about the past, in the present, and how we might reshape the future. To all of our donors, your gifts have provided this annual opportunity for us as a community to learn, question, and participate in events that shape the world in which we live. And to the staff and volunteers who do all of the heavy lifting behind the scenes to organize the event and deliver such a wonderful evening, thank you for your hours, for your dedication to bring us this memorable evening. And again, I want to express my gratitude to each and every one of you for participating in this lectureship, for being alongside Dr. Blackstock, and to our elders, Cookham Hazel and Elder Gilman, from my heart to yours, thank you for starting us off in a good way and being alongside us throughout the day. Enjoy your evening. Please drive safely and take very good care. Thanks very much for coming.